You might believe in destiny. But if you ask me, and I'm glad you did, there is one powerful force that drives human behavior and changes the world. Money. This is room 214 in the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. It was in this very room that back in 1972, White House aides G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt oversaw the break-in to Democratic headquarters that led to the Watergate scandal. One of the most famous phrases from that scandal is, of course, "follow the money," which Deep Throat said to Bob Woodward in that parking garage. But he never really said it, and Woodward and Bernstein never really wrote it. The line comes from the movie All the President's Men. But we remember that line because it captures an essential truth. If you really want to know what happened at Watergate, as well as a lot of other things in our history, you gotta follow the money.
But in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent.
Even as he was consumed by the Watergate scandal, President Nixon took the time to lie about his income tax evasion.
That in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
One of the things that Nixon always insisted is that he was never in it for the money.
Right.
As if that's makes it okay.
Right.
But he kind of was.
He clearly was, yeah. You know,
right.
He always wanted to be seated at the cool kids table, and he never got there. And so he wanted money, he wanted the things that money, could buy, like beautiful houses and such. So he really did like money and really wanted money, personal money, not just money for his campaigns.
Nixon leapt to national fame in 1952 when Dwight Eisenhower chose him as his vice presidential running mate. But just 2 months later, Nixon endured his first major scandal. His political backers had established a fund to cover expenses, or, as the New York Post put it, secret rich men's trust fund keeps Nixon in style far beyond his salary. And that's why we need tabloids. On September 23, 1952, NBC broadcast a brand new soap opera. There was just one episode.
The following program is sponsored by the Republican National Committee.
Not 1 cent of the $18,000 or any other money of that type ever went to me for my personal use.
60 million Americans, the largest TV audience to that time, heard or saw that speech. And what they saw, the nation decided, was an honest man. It worked. Nixon was now down the hall from ultimate power, but he had a little problem. Specifically, a little brother. I didn't realize that Nixon, like Jimmy Carter, like certain other,
like Teddy Roosevelt, like Billy.
they all had like crazy brothers.
Yeah.
And his brother Don Nixon ran a hamburger stand.
Yes, an aspiring chain of drive-through burger joints, and was not very good at it, and it wasn't doing particularly well. And lo and behold, he gets a big loan from a guy named Howard Hughes.
Yep, that Howard Hughes. Famed film producer, lover of leading ladies, aerospace and casino mogul, and charter member of the Billionaire Recluse Hall of Fame.
Howard Hughes testifies regarding his $40 million plane contract before a Senate War Investigating Committee.
Well, I'll ask you again. Will you bring Mr. Mars in at the 2 o'clock session?
No, I don't think I will.
Will you try to bring him in?
No, I don't think I'll try.
In 1957, Hughes loaned $205,000 to Donald Nixon to prop up his chain of fast food joints named, imaginatively, Nixon's. Perhaps Hughes just really loved the Nixon burger, and since it was only 20 cents with cheese, he could afford about 1 billion of them. By sheer coincidence, the thoughtful leg up to Donald Nixon was followed by the feds granting lucrative new routes to Hughes-owned Transworld Airlines. Nixon continued his relentless climb to the top, until the story broke days before the 1960 election. Nixon insisted the loan had nothing to do with him. It was for Donald and guaranteed by their mother, Hannah Nixon.
I want all of you to know.
Was it that famous televised debate that cost Nixon the election? Just as likely, it was the Nixon burger scandal.
I want Senator Kennedy to know, and I want all of you to know, that certainly if this trend does continue and he does become our next president, that he will have my wholehearted support and yours too.
Fast forward to 1968. Nixon and Hughes are back in the swamp. They crave power and influence. Hughes brags that there is no man on earth he can't buy or destroy. For Nixon, that's an easy choice.
In 1968, his industries are facing tough, scrutiny from Washington and regulations, and he wants some relief. And he decides that Nixon, a Republican, has to be elected. So he ends up giving $100,000, not directly to Nixon, but to one of Nixon's friends, a guy named B.B. Rebozo, which is,
God bless B.B. Rebozo.
In the Hall of Fame of American names, up there with, Kiki Vandeweghe and Zsa Zsa Gabor, and is B.B. Rebozo. And he's this buddy of Nixon, fixer kind of a guy, and he takes the money, and it is believed that a lot of that money went right into Nixon's pocket, not just into the election.
The cash in $100 bills passed from B.B. the bagman to Nixon's pocket. And from there to improvements in Nixon's estate in Key Biscayne, Florida, some remodeling, a new swimming pool, and Arnold Palmer putting green. Very nice. Oh, hi. You've caught me indulging my inner Woodward and Bernstein. So the current owners of the Watergate Hotel have created this scandal room to commemorate the history and also to make a little money. You can rent it out. That's appropriate because it was Richard Nixon's obsessions with history and money that led to his downfall. He installed the White House taping system so that he could control how history would remember him. And it worked, sort of. And that money from Howard Hughes, he was an intelligent man. He must have known he should not take it. But there it was. A Senate investigation later concluded that the $100,000 was just one of several payoffs Hughes made to Nixon. On the White House tapes, those bribes are politely referred to as Florida dealings.
Having lost a close one 8 years ago and having won a close one this year, I can say this: winning's a lot more fun. Preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
Nixon lived in dread that Hughes would expose their secret.
So help me God.
Nixon's paranoia hit the boiling point when Kennedy confidant Lawrence O'Brien took on two jobs: Washington lobbyist for Howard Hughes and chairman of the Democratic National Committee. The White House went on high alert. Did O'Brien know about the Hughes payments to Nixon? Would he reveal them before the 1972 election? Nixon had to know.
Get it done. I want it done.
O'Brien's taxes were audited, his home burgled. Then, on June 17, 1972, 5 men were caught breaking into his office at the Watergate complex. In his audio diary, Nixon Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman connects the dots from the Hughes bribe to the Watergate break-in.
Jebb's view is the following, that the plan was hatched at the White House by Hunt, Liddy, and Colson. Colson called Jebb twice to tell him to get going on this thing, specifically the Larry O'Brien information regarding the Florida dealings.
Then, of course, after the initial break-in that was caught in Watergate, they had to pony up what they thought might be as much as $1 million to pay to silence the 5 guys that broke into the Watergate hotel.
In fact, that was one of the famous Watergate tapes,
Yeah.
where Nixon says, what would it take?
Yeah, asked John Dean.
Right. What would it take to keep these guys quiet? And Dean says it would take about $1 million. And Nixon says, we could do that.
Yeah.
And then the story they came out with was the tape didn't pick him up saying, but that would be wrong.
Yeah.
Which is truly one of the great dumb excuses
Right.
in all of American history.
I would say these people are going to cost $1 million over the next few years. You, on the money, you need the money. I mean, you can get the money. Well, I think that's where... What I mean is, you can get $1 million, and you can get it in cash. I know where it can be gotten.
Nixon's team paid $400,000 in blackmail to the Watergate defendants, $2.5 million in today's money. Like their boss, his henchmen saw themselves as tough guys, and like him, they had seen too many heist movies. Cash was dropped in phone booths, under park benches, and in airport lockers. As a child, I remember hearing the phrase slush fund and thinking, oh, that sounds really messy. Well, Nixon's re-election campaign was one big pile of slush. Millions in illegal contributions went for political dirty tricks as Nixon used the FBI, CIA, and IRS to persecute his enemies and secure his re-election. One of the things, of course, that we forget about Watergate is to the extent that they had this sort of guerrilla operation to sabotage the Democrats, it worked.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we don't talk about that enough. I mean, you think of a two-bit robbery, you think of these incompetent fools running around, but they actually, well, I won't say stole, but certainly influenced an election through illicit means.
Right, they did. I mean, in fact, you know, going into that election, Ed Muskie was the leading candidate, and that was the candidate that Nixon really feared. And the Dirty Trick Squad planted this story that he had slurred, Canadian
Right.
Americans by using the word Canuck. And Muskie then, and you know,
It
and
seems so quaint.
Yeah, it is. It's really, it's a,
like, oh, he said Canuck. He
yes,
can't be president.
Merciful heavens, he said it in public, no less. Yeah, and then Muskie gives this very emotional press conference and kind of clearly starts to cry a little bit, and it seems like a shaken man, and he just plummets.
Nixon got the opponent he wanted, crushing George McGovern. But Woodward and Bernstein followed the money, and the scandal finally broke wide open. In full cover-up mode, Nixon fought back with delicious, unintended irony.
I want the American people, I want you to know beyond the shadow of a doubt that during my term as president, justice will be pursued fairly, fully, and impartially, no matter who is involved.
Did he ever express at any time any regret for any of this? Did he ever say, I made a mistake, I shouldn't have done that, I shouldn't have been so interested in money, I shouldn't have been so interested in whatever? No,
Nixon, I think, believed that he was a victim of his enemies and really felt that he hadn't done much of anything wrong at all, and that he was simply the victim of circumstance, a victim of this coalescence of his enemies.
Wow, that's crazy.
But it fits his character. It's the way he operated. He really felt like it was him against the world, and he felt that even when he was on top. So he wins by this unprecedented landslide, and of course, in the months leading up to that, commits all these crimes and then begins the cover-up. So it's just, he's a one-man Greek tragedy. It's amazing.
Right. Always give your best.
Never get discouraged. Never be petty. Always remember, others may hate you, Those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself.
Today, you can see Nixon's obsessions in two adjacent buildings in Washington, D.C. The John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts and the Watergate complex. To his dying day, Richard Nixon believed that the Kennedys had used their family fortune to steal the 1960 election away from him. But his resentment of the moneyed elite went back much further than that. When he was a teenager growing up in Whittier, California, working class, he actually got accepted to Harvard with free tuition. But he couldn't go because his family couldn't afford even the travel or the board. He went to a local school instead. So, for the rest of his life, Richard Nixon was determined to follow the money. As a New Jersey high school student in the early 1980s, I learned all about the lost cause of the Civil War. It was this tragic struggle, brother between brother, all fought to preserve something very important called states' rights. It was replete with gallantry and heroism, and it had some really great fiddle tunes. It wasn't until later that I thought to ask the question, a state's right to do what? Exactly. Well, as it turns out, it was the right to treat other human beings as cattle, to buy and sell them, to beat them and kill them and rape them. Also, they could, as Lincoln put it, wring their bread from the sweat of another's brow. But why was I, born a century after the war, taught a false history about it? Why did my northern school teach me the Southern myth? How come instead of Nat Turner and Frederick Douglass, I got Rhett and Scarlett? In Technicolor, even catastrophe is glorious. Margaret Mitchell's husband, seeing rebel extras stretching to the horizon as Atlanta burned on the RKO back lot, remarked, "If we had had that many soldiers, we would have won." This has started to be a story that the South told about themselves within living memory of the people who had done it.
Yeah, and it certainly played well among them.
Right.
It also, part of that narrative was also the reason you lost is not because you were lesser.
Right.
In fact, you were superior. You had more nobility, more honor, more courage. You only lost because the other side was just so overwhelmingly huge, this giant, soulless industrial machine.
North crushed the poor agrarian, yet, and amazing how they fought given their lack of resources.
So you get super props for going down, valiantly and so forth. And then the other part of that is that it wasn't about slavery, but by the way, slavery wasn't all that bad.
Right. Nothing says it better than the prologue to Gone with the Wind. There was a land of cavaliers and cotton fields called the Old South. Here gallantry took its last bow. Here was the last of master and slave. Slave plantations weren't the last outpost of chivalry. They were America's first big business. Take free labor, add a global demand for textiles, and you've got an industrial behemoth. You can follow the money from consumer to mill to planter who used it to buy more slaves. In the words of one fugitive slave, when the price of cotton rises in the English market, the poor slaves are harder driven, and the whip is kept constantly going. By 1860, the South was wealthier than any European country except England. And it was all thanks to King Cotton.
Oh, Dixie, the land of King Cotton, the home of the brave and free, a nation by freedom begotten, the terror of despots to be.
They were fighting for slavery because slavery was basically the engine of the entire Southern economy, right?
Right, and also the Southern identity. So you have about 1/3 of Southern families in what becomes the Confederacy own slaves. So it's a pretty substantial number. And then of that 2/3 that don't own, there's certainly a very large proportion who aspired to. Like that was, they weren't there yet, but they hoped in 10 or 20 years they may do what successful people do, which is to own enslaved labor.
Yeah.
So there's that aspiration. And then there's also just the value, that sort of intangible value of white supremacy, which is that no matter how poor I am as a white farmer or a white mechanic or what have you in the South, I am better than millions of other people in this society. There's a floor below which I cannot fall because that's where the enslaved people are.
In the 1830s, England made the moral decision to abolish slavery, and they came up with a pile of cash to compensate the slave owners. But Southern slave masters refused to relinquish their property at any price. They were both rich and self-righteous.
Slaveholders told themselves lots of stories while they were holding slaves. And they told themselves how great they were, how kind they were, how benevolent the system was. And they sold that in photos, in images, in plays, and music.
Even prior to the Civil War, that there was this notion, oh, no, we're treating them very well, they're better off. Oh, you don't know how bad they had it in Africa.
Abolitionists are crazy.
I mean, I understand who they were trying to fool. Were they fooling themselves? Did they actually believe this?
They do. Some do. There's a lot of evidence that as the Civil War comes along, and of course it's incredibly disruptive, many of the men are off fighting, and so women are head of the household. And as things begin to unravel in the South, the enslaved people start to realize that they could walk away, and they start to resist. And there's these really amazing, letters people write to each other. A woman writing to her sister saying, "You will never believe what happened today. They left. They just packed up and left after all we've done for them."
Rebel leaders were clear-eyed and brutally honest. The Mississippi Declaration of Secession proclaimed, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. A blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization." So the Confederate Army couldn't conquer the North, but this myth of the lost cause eventually did. And I think it's because we somehow needed it to be true. There had to be something noble about the Confederacy. It couldn't be that half the nation took up arms to defend evil. Consider Robert E. Lee, for example. I was taught that he was a gentleman, a reluctant warrior who acted out of a kind of tragic loyalty to his state rather than his country. He was a good Christian, and he hated slavery, right? Well, Robert E. Lee himself owned 200 slaves, and when his property displeased him, he lashed them 50 times with a bullwhip because, as Robert E. Lee wrote, this painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race. So, how did this slaver and traitor become a hero on 1,000 pedestals? Well, the beard helped. It's important to look the part.
They've caught a spy. I approve the execution order, sir.
I am unwilling that there shall be a single life lost unnecessarily. I wonder if you'd mind countermanding that order.
I will, yes, sir.
Lee lived under foreign domination. He led a sacred cause and fell at the hands of the unrighteous, just like Jesus. Oh, here's my favorite part. No less than FDR called Lee one of our greatest American Christians. Churchill upped the ante. He said he was the noblest American who ever lived. Take that, Lincoln, you loser. Jesus Christ and Robert E. Lee. Really, the only difference is that the historical Jesus was almost certainly dark-skinned. But here's the real message. If Lee was divinely virtuous, then so was the Southern cause. Thankfully, Frederick Douglass dispensed with these rose-colored glasses. When Lee died, Douglass wrote, "We can scarcely take up a newspaper that is not filled with nauseating flatteries. It would seem that the soldier who kills the most men in battle, even in a bad cause, is the greatest Christian and entitled to the highest place in heaven." As payback for Lee's treason, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton seized his stately home and converted the grounds into Arlington National Cemetery. There's a reason people describe the cost of war as blood and treasure, but some people who had enough treasure could avoid giving any blood. Up north, the powers that be agreed that they should not have to dirty their fine hands. The draft law allowed anyone to buy a substitute for $300, the annual income of a working man. Oddly, not everyone was thrilled with this system.
Lots of working class people begin to really push back against the draft, and that pushback explodes in July of 1863. In New York City, 4 days of full-on rioting. It's the worst civil uprising in American history. They destroyed buildings, they destroyed recruiting offices. They also beat up rich people. They would say, "There goes a $300 man," and run across the street and pound a guy who looked wealthy, because the assumption was he's here because he's bought his way out of the draft.
The war begun to protect wealthy landowners ends by jump-starting the industrial age. Cornelius Vanderbilt and railroads, J.P. Morgan and weapons, Andrew Carnegie and iron, John D. Rockefeller and oil, all made their first fortunes as war speculators. Those who follow the money had learned a priceless lesson. War is good for business. After the war, both sides were eager to get back to business. Widespread segregation recreated a permanent black underclass, a source of cheap labor to make the white man, North and South, rich. The lost cause becomes a national myth.
It's just so much easier to buy that narrative, to say it was a big mistake, it wasn't about slavery, and now the real story is reunification, this idea, reconciliation, that both sides are to blame, and you see this in the annual commemorations.
All of them we honor, not asking under which flag they fought then, thankful that they stand together under one flag now.
So the reason I was taught these myths in high school, meaning the reason that this became the nationally accepted version, is because believing that was important to the national economy for 100 years. Oh, it's okay that we have this underpaid lower caste of black people because they underpinned a lot of our economy.
Right,
It was in everybody's financial interest to lie about the history.
Right, everything is fine as it is, and of course in the 20th century, post-war, white Americans' fortunes are soaring. It's the great post-war boom, and so it's easy to sort of focus on that as saying we, as a country, are doing great.
Yeah,
even though
we're doing great. We've always been great.
Yeah. And there's a subset that is not doing great.
We had this little disagreement, but it's fine. It's okay. We have some memorials now. Everything's cool. Everybody's happy about it, except for those people, but no one's going to ask them.
Right.
There is a statue of Abraham Lincoln in Manchester, England. That is an ocean beyond the farthest he ever traveled in life. During the Civil War, the Confederacy shipped slave-grown cotton to Manchester to be processed. In exchange, they hoped for money to fund their war, but the British mill workers refused to work with the slave-grown cotton. They had a lot of sympathy for the slaves, and they certainly did not want to help the slave masters. Abraham Lincoln called their sacrifice sublime Christian heroism. So now there's a statue to him there. It's kind of amazing, really, that these British workers, pretty poor themselves, decided to put principle over self-interest. In the end, they were the ones who finally wouldn't follow the money. Abraham Lincoln had lots of problems. One of them, of course, was keeping the Union together north and south, but he also had to work on keeping East and West together. The California Gold Rush brought a lot of people to California, including Southerners who brought their slaves. I mean, somebody had to do the digging, right? So when the Civil War broke out, there was actually a lot of Confederate sympathy in California. There was even talk of creating a pro-slavery Pacific Republic. So in order to keep them in the Union, Lincoln made them this amazing offer. How about a transcontinental railroad and all the wealth that would come with it? In his classic work, Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville cast a shrewd eye on the American character. Americans, he wrote, were destined to annihilate time and space. He was talking about the amazing new invention, the railroad, that would follow the money from sea to shining sea. Railroads were the original high-speed network. They were as expansive, disruptive, and lucrative as the internet is today.
Railroads are the largest corporations in the world, the American railroads are. And they're unprecedented. It's one thing to have a large, powerful company, but this is a company that spans many states, in fact, spans the entire nation. It's getting its financing from something called Wall Street and stocks and bonds. And in fact, the idea of a corporation is a relative, this kind of corporation, and trusts. These are all new financial instruments.
Right.
And so the how to do big industry is being written by the railroads.
These old trains taught 21st century monopolists how to get rich. Today, if you buy something, almost anything, Amazon dictates the terms of the transaction and gets a cut. Why? Because they control the infrastructure. The buyer and seller have to go through them. Guess where Amazon got its business model from?
The railroads control all this, the lifelines of commerce throughout the country, particularly in the West. And so you can have this fantastic crop in Iowa and do everything right and raise this amazing boomer crop of corn, and you are stuck.
Right.
In terms of, you've got one way to get that to market, and that's through the railroad.
Right.
There's no competition. The railroads can charge you whatever they want.
You might think it was lunacy for Lincoln to launch a transcontinental railroad during the Civil War. It would be kind of like FDR saying, let's beat Hitler and put a man on the moon. But Lincoln knew keeping the 49ers in California happy would keep gold flowing back east to fund the war. And a railroad would go far towards persuading that big blank space in the middle to eventually join the Union. Movies have made us believe that the Wild West was tamed by rugged individuals with a gun on one hip and a gal on the other. Don't believe it. Achieving manifest destiny took thousands of grunt workers, millions of dollars, massive corporate interests, and stupendous government funding. Many of those dollars went into the pockets of a few Sacramento speculators known as the Associates. Their homes were monuments to their wealth and their chutzpah. Collis Huntington once told French reporters, "Your Eiffel Tower is all very well, but where's the money in it?" In 1865, Huntington exploited the chaos and grief after Lincoln's murder to push through a bill extending his railroad line. His partner, Leland Stanford, was governor of California at the same time he headed the Central Pacific Railroad, and he somehow got the state to kick in $15 million to start track construction. Okay, this was olden times and they had different ideas about morality, but still, how could such astounding corruption ever be possible? And because it's a massive government program, all that money gets spent and it's all accounted for and everything's honest and nothing bad happens, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Everything squares up at the end. Yes. Well, not exactly. At the end of the day, they know that they want to keep Congress out of the picture as much as possible. They don't want any oversight. So One way to do that is to give a lot of this stock to congressmen, and that tends to keep them quiet.
Free from interference, the rail tycoons wrote the book on defrauding Washington. They were paid by the mile of track laid, so they created winding, circuitous routes to maximize mileage. Builders received a premium for track laid over mountains, but the term mountain was not defined. Stanford hired geologists to survey the route, and wouldn't you know it, they discovered that the Sierra Nevada range starts way back here in Sacramento. The best scandals are always the railroad scandals. They tend to be very large, somewhat complicated, very colorful, and really expensive. And of the railroad scandals, one of the greatest was the credit mobilier scandal of the 19th century. It started when the Union Pacific Railroad charged the US government twice what it actually cost to build the railroad. The rest of the money went into the pockets of the owners and also was paid out in bribes to practically the entire US government, including multiple members of the House, including the Speaker of the House, 4 senators, 1 Secretary of the Treasury, and the Vice President of the United States. And by the way, these were guys from both parties. It was really, in a weird way, encouraging to see such bipartisan corruption. Here's a cartoon of the day depicting the credit mobilier ward in the Union Pacific Hospital. The scandal threatened to bring down the whole pyramid of greed, debt, and double dealing. But it turns out the Transcontinental Railroad was just too big to fail. So the robber barons lived to steal another day. The Iron Monster was a technological marvel that embodied America's march of progress. Walt Whitman sang its praises, type of the modern, emblem of motion and power, pulse of the continent. The view was different and a tad less romantic on the ground. On the theory that the people who had built the Great Wall could surely handle a railroad, thousands of Chinese laborers were hired.
So they're willing to come and do this kind of work, but they're going to be incredibly cheap. You can pay a Chinese laborer, I mean, it's explicit racism, but you can pay a Chinese laborer much lower wages and work them much longer hours, and also send them to do the most dangerous jobs, you know, to set the dynamite charges and that kind of thing, because you have that kind of power over them.
The Chinese worked really hard and didn't complain, which was a mistake. Other immigrants hated the competition, and the Chinese Exclusion Act soon banned Chinese from entering the country and denied citizenship to those already in the U.S. On May 10th, 1869, the nation waited breathlessly for word that the continent was united. But people were like paying attention via telegraph or their newspapers, like everybody knew it was going to happen.
And they brought photographers, and they set up that very dramatic picture that many people have seen, which is the two locomotives nose to nose, hundreds of workers, champagne bottles in hand, and all the the key figures of the railroad are there. Right. And it's a great moment, and they set it up very dramatically. They have a golden spike that's specially forged, and a silver hammer, and Leland Stanford gets the honor of driving that last spike. They have telegraph wire connected to it, so that when he hammers in the spike, it sends out a signal to the world. They knew that people were gathering in big open squares. Most big cities had newspaper row, all the collections of newspapers. So thousands of people are gathering for this ceremony. And when the lights go on or somebody fires off a gun to say the continent is spanned, is literally as dramatic a moment in people's minds as when Neil Armstrong walks on the moon. It's just got that, can you believe what we have just pulled off?
The triumphant headlines missed another story. The line had been built so quickly and so shoddily that it would take 5 more years to repair and reposition large sections of poorly laid track. Huntington and Stanford pioneered the practice of spending other people's money. Each invested a paltry few $1,000s and ended up with $20 billion in today's money. It's nice work if you can get it. In those days, it was customary for the ultra-rich to endow great centers of higher learning. For example, Leland Stanford and his Stanford University. In 1975, the Stanford administrators decided to retire their somewhat problematic Indian mascot, and they asked the student body to pick a new symbol to represent Stanford to the world. And the students overwhelmingly voted for the Stanford Robber Barons. The administration did not go for that, and to this day, Stanford does not have an official mascot. But those students, they knew their history. They just looked around and followed the money. The railroad had conquered space and time.
When you have these intersecting networks of railroads, it's really important that 12 o'clock in New York is 12 o'clock in Baltimore, is 12 o'clock anywhere else. Because when you're setting up schedules where trains crisscross tracks...
Yeah, if the train is leaving here at noon and getting there at 2, then their clock better be the same clock as you have, otherwise the train is going to run into another one.
Right, and it's going to be disastrous and expensive and everything else. So in 1883, the big railroads got together without Congress, without any government oversight, and just divided up the American continent into 4 time zones. And worked it out so that there was standard time and then also the time zones.
Back when this railroad thing was but a dream, it seemed so risky that private investors needed a sweetener. Land. Lots and lots of land. Over 12,000 acres for every mile of track built. In the end, land grants from state and federal governments transferred 180 million acres into private hands, an area bigger than Texas. The rail barons became empire builders, making further fortunes from coal, iron, silver, lumber, and livestock. And what about those rugged Americans who settled the West? Those legendary icons of freedom and independence. They lived at the mercy of their landlords, the railroad tycoons. This Trident nuclear missile, with its multiple warheads, could obliterate up to 6 enemy cities, all for the low price of $70 million a missile. That is a fraction of what our military currently spends on bands. But the Reagan administration wanted something a little flashier, you know, and a lot more expensive. So, for example, the B-2 stealth bomber. Couldn't go as far as this missile, couldn't do as much damage, was easier to deter, but man, it was intimidatingly expensive. At $2 billion a plane, it might have been cheaper to build each one out of solid gold. It was as if we were trying to bling the Soviet Union into submission. Comprehending the trillions of dollars and rubles spent on the military during the Cold War is like trying to count the stars in heaven. No mere number, no matter how many zeros, can convey the scope. I was born in the middle of the Cold War, and I lived to see it end. I was taught it was a struggle between good and evil, freedom and tyranny. But follow the money, and it leads straight to the corner store. Once the Soviet people got a taste of our blue jeans and silk stockings and fast food, it was no contest. They had always been told, we know, through Soviet propaganda, that Americans live terribly and we have terrible race problems and people are impoverished and we're all slaves to our capitalist masters. But then they got, you know, a glimpse of like what our supermarkets were like and like, wait a minute, that's fantastic.
Right. I mean, that has a big, when the information starts to flow, you know, you can only hold off information for so long. And when real live information began to come into the Soviet Union about living standards, whether it was the US or it was just simply West Germany, it was stunning to people. They realized that these are places that are not on the verge of collapse. They're not at war with themselves. They actually seem to be quite peaceful and quite prosperous. And wouldn't it be nice to get a little bit of that?
Yeah. I mean, so in a weird way, the Cold War came to an end because people wanted a better choice of breakfast cereal.
Yes, exactly. And maybe a, you know, spare roll of toilet paper.
Eisenhower presided over the first decade of the Cold War, even as he warned about its dire cost.
Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children.
Such honesty would soon become political death, denounced as weakness or worse, disloyalty. No mere president could halt the juggernaut of defense spending. By 1959, it consumed over half the federal budget. For decades, the arms race generated trillions in profits.
Governor Ronald Reagan has ended this grueling system.
Then in 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected president, thanks in part by promising to dramatically increase defense spending.
If you have the means to defend your freedom, you won't have to use those means. And that's what we're all aiming at.
Reagan wanted victory over the evil empire, and he saw a way to get there: bankrupt them. Spend more than they could ever match. As he wrote in his diary, if we can cut off their credit, they'll have to yell uncle or starve. Soviet citizens had long endured a horrendous standard of living. Only 1 in 3 apartments had hot water. Only 1 in 10 people had a telephone. And the waiting time for a new apartment was 15 years. The state-run economy was a joke, literally. As the saying went, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us.
You have an enormous military budget. You know, 20%, by some measures, 20% of GDP in the Soviet Union is going to this huge military that will not budge when it comes to the budget. They're not going to give an inch on that. So
And we often forget this, that they had their own Vietnam, a long drawn-out
Right.
war in Afghanistan
Yeah.
in the 70s and early 80s.
Which plays into the political part of it, right? So
Right.
it's not just a collapsing communist economy, it's a collapsing political order. So
Right.
they invade Afghanistan in 1979, thinking it's going to be quick and easy, and it turned out to be a disaster.
Soviet troops would spend 9 miserable years in Afghanistan, stuck in a bloody stalemate with local guerrillas.
Mr. Gorbachev wants to bring the Communist Party up to date. Its old-fashioned methods are blocking his reforms at home and abroad.
In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev took the reins of power. After years of doddering commissars and apparatchiks, here was a man in the mold of Western politicians. Gorbachev knew his country had to modernize. He introduced glasnost, a new openness. But a little freedom can be a dangerous thing.
When you have glasnost right at the time when there's a lot of simmering discontent, people
Right.
are furious about the economy, they're furious about corruption, they're furious about the inadequate supply of everything. They're also furious about the war. There's tremendous anti-war opposition, and when you allow for people to freely discuss that and publish it,
Right.
and then have external sources of information, dissident writers and things, it is a recipe for disaster.
In 1990, journalist David Remnick attended a screening of the movie Wall Street in Moscow. Now, Oliver Stone intended the movie to be an indictment of reckless greed, but it didn't play that way. To the Russians, it was like affluence porn. Look at that guy. He had tailored shirts and really expensive hair. He had a TV in his limo. When he parked it at home, he had a house with a TV, with a car, with another TV inside it. When Michael Douglas says his immortal line meant to demonstrate his dark, twisted soul, the Russians exploded in applause. Greed is good, or as he was dubbed in Russian, Zhadnost et horosho. Zhadnost et horosho. Russians had discovered the delights of capitalism. They no longer feared the West or their own leaders. The Soviet Union was essentially a third world economy boosted by petrodollars. But in the late 80s, Saudi Arabia, encouraged by the US, drastically increased its oil production and cut prices by 2/3. Soviet oil revenue plummeted.
The two fellows in the Soviet Union were walking down the street, and the one of them says, "Have we really achieved full communism? Is this it? Is this now full communism?" And the other one said, "Oh, hell no, things are going to get a lot worse."
The truth could no longer be masked by lies. Communism had utterly failed to provide a minimum standard of living. One Soviet economist remarked, "For decades, we've strived for universal equality. Now we have equality in poverty." The final nail in the Soviet coffin was a fantastic, futuristic vision.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, was immediately dubbed Star Wars. The nickname conjured up real images, well, real fake images from movies, that made it all the more plausible.
The flight was the first in a series of test flights that will use a kinetic energy Eris interceptor to destroy a simulated enemy warhead.
We had these missiles that they couldn't stop, and they had these missiles that we couldn't stop, so nobody was going to go to war.
Yeah, mutually assured destruction.
Right. And then all of a sudden we're saying, aha, we've got this system, this incredibly expensive system that will stop your missiles and that will totally shift the balance of power. And that sent the Soviet Union into kind of a panic.
Right.
A quick look assessment of the first Eris interceptor test flight indicates it was a successful mission.
The White House doled out the goodies. Contracts worth billions were awarded to companies in no less than 40 states. Whether or not SDI ever worked, Gorbachev believed it could, and he knew he could never muster the resources to compete with it. The United States, Gorbachev told his people, wants to exhaust the Soviet Union economically through an arms race and the most up-to-date and expensive space weapons.
There's also a huge technological gap. I mean,
Right.
by 1980, the personal computer revolution is on in the United States, and we often sort of forget how revolutionary that was in everything, economics, education, information systems, and so forth. And the Soviets were wedded to these 1960s gigantic, building-sized IBM-like computers. And so they weren't able to make that, they knew they couldn't make that shift.
Right. Desperate to cut costs, Gorbachev devised a brilliant last-ditch gambit. He offered to cut nuclear arsenals in half if the U.S. dropped SDI. Panicked, the American defense industry went on red alert. It was a doomsday scenario, the loss of trillions of dollars from Star Wars and nukes. The military-industrial complex went into overdrive to stop Reagan from taking the deal.
Air Force One touched down at Keflavik NATO base in Iceland tonight, carrying Ronald Reagan on the 20th and potentially most important foreign journey of his 6-year presidency.
After nerve-wracking suspense, the Reykjavik summit ended in failure. Order had been restored. Soon after, in 1989, one Eastern Bloc country after another broke free from the Soviet Empire. In Russia, Gorbachev gave way to President Boris Yeltsin. That same year, 500,000 American troops descended on the Persian Gulf. The United States and Russia joined forces to liberate oil-rich Kuwait from the clutches of Saddam Hussein.
Listen to Master Sergeant J.P. Kendall of the 82nd Airborne. We're here for more than just the price of a gallon of gas. What we're doing is going to chart the future of the world for the next 100 years. It's better to deal with this guy now than 5 years from now.
American forces would soon spend 2 decades at war. From Moscow to the Middle East, capitalism had won. But it would always, always keep fighting. A few months after the fall of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev attended the 75th anniversary celebration for Forbes magazine at Radio City Music Hall. He and Ronald Reagan both appeared to demonstrate their historic friendship, and also because they were each paid $2 million. Meanwhile, new Russian President Boris Yeltsin was trying to keep his country from staggering, much as he did. Now, Yeltsin had grown up with Soviet communism and was still a true believer. He thought capitalism was this savage system where all the wealth was hoarded by the elite while the proletariat suffered. And then he took a trip to Houston and visited a supermarket a proletarian supermarket. And he was amazed at all the fresh meat and produce and fish, the 20 different kinds of spaghetti sauce. He saw shapes of pasta heretofore undreamt of by man. Not even the Tsar himself had imagined such riches. On the flight back to Moscow, Yeltsin turned to his closest aide and quietly confessed that he was no longer a communist. Boris Yeltsin had learned to follow the money.